July 6, 1944. Northern Germany, Peenemünde Testing Grounds. The clock showed 9:13 a.m. when test pilot Heini Dittmar settled into the cramped cockpit of his Messerschmitt Me-163 Komet. This peculiar machine weighed barely 4,000 pounds and lacked conventional landing gear, just a wheel trolley that would drop away after liftoff. Its rocket engine held fuel for a mere 7 minutes of powered flight. Today's mission: push this aircraft beyond any speed humanity had achieved. Weather conditions were ideal: clear skies, gentle winds. Perfect for attempting something this dangerous. Dittmar had previous experience with this aircraft type, but never at maximum thrust, never testing the absolute boundaries of what it could handle. This attempt was different. The engineering team had calculated every variable and determined the theoretical speed limit. They understood the structural stresses the airframe should tolerate. But theoretical calculations and actual performance rarely aligned perfectly, especially at unprecedented velocities. The engineers, watching from the runway, understood the mortal risk. This aircraft had already claimed multiple test pilots during development. The rocket propellant was extraordinarily volatile, capable of dissolving human tissue on contact. No ejection seat existed. If something failed at extreme speed, Dittmar would have mere seconds to respond before the aircraft disintegrated around him. Yet speed had become everything by 1944. Germany was losing the war. Allied bombing raids filled German skies daily, protected by escort fighters that Luftwaffe pilots could no longer match effectively. The German Air Force desperately needed something revolutionary: an interceptor capable of reaching bomber formations before Allied escorts could respond, something faster than anything American or British forces possessed. The Me-163 represented that hope. Rocket-powered, tailless, designed by glider specialist Alexander Lippisch. On paper, it embodied aviation's future. In practice, it was killing German pilots faster than it destroyed Allied bombers. Dittmar had been testing variants of this design since 1941. On October 2nd of that year, he had established a world speed record of 1,004.5 kilometers per hour in an earlier prototype, an extraordinary achievement. He had taken off from Peenemünde in the Me-163 AV-4, an unpowered glider towed to altitude by a Messerschmitt Bf-110. At 3,000 meters, he released from the tow aircraft. The Walter rocket motor ignited. The acceleration defied anything pilots had experienced. Within seconds, Dittmar was traveling faster than any propeller-driven fighter could achieve. He pushed the aircraft to 1,004.5 kilometers per hour in level flight, becoming the first human to exceed 1,000 kilometers per hour. The flight lasted only minutes before fuel exhaustion, but it proved rocket propulsion could achieve speeds impossible for conventional aircraft. That record, however, was set in level flight with an older, less powerful engine. The Me-163A had been a proof of concept, demonstrating rocket-powered flight's feasibility. Today's test differed fundamentally. Dittmar would push the Me-163 BV-18 to its absolute limit. The aircraft featured modifications, including a new dual-chamber Walter HWK 509A rocket motor. More power, more thrust, more speed. Engineering estimates suggested it could reach 1,100 kilometers per hour, approximately 700 miles per hour. Nothing with wings had ever moved that fast. At 9:16, Dittmar signaled readiness. Ground crew stepped back. The rocket motor ignited. A geyser of flame erupted from the tail section. The Me-163 rolled forward, accelerated faster than any aircraft Dittmar had ever flown, and lifted off. The wheeled trolley fell away. For the next 3 minutes, Dittmar climbed nearly vertical at an angle that would have stalled any conventional fighter. The Me-163 climbed like a missile. 6,000 meters, 8,000 meters, 10,000 meters. At 12,000 meters, Dittmar leveled off and pushed the throttle to maximum. The rocket motor roared. The aircraft surged forward. The airspeed indicator climbed past 1,000 kilometers per hour. 1,050, 1,100, 1,130 kilometers per hour, 702 miles per hour. Then Dittmar felt the aircraft shudder. The rudder surface began to flutter. At that speed, at that altitude, aerodynamic forces were tearing the tail apart. Dittmar cut the engine immediately. The rocket motor shut down. Suddenly, the cockpit was silent except for wind screaming past the canopy. He was gliding now. No power. No way to restart the engine. 12,000 meters above northern Germany, with most of his vertical rudder about to separate from the airframe. Dittmar had 8 minutes to return to Earth before running out of sky. He nosed down gently, bleeding off speed, trying not to stress the damaged rudder further. The Mi-163 glided like the sailplane it essentially was. Dittmar had started his career as a glider pilot. He knew how to handle unpowered aircraft. But he had never glided an aircraft that was structurally failing at high altitude. He descended through 8,000 meters. 6,000, 4,000. The runway at Piemont came into view. Dittmar lined up for landing approach. The Mi-163 had no landing gear. It landed on a retractable skid under the fuselage. One chance to execute this correctly. Hit too hard and the aircraft would cartwheel. Come in too shallow and he would overshoot the runway. At 300 meters altitude, Dittmar committed to the approach. The aircraft dropped toward the runway. The ground rushed up. At the last second, Dittmar pulled back on the stick. The Mi-163 flared. The skid touched concrete. The aircraft skidded down the runway, trailing sparks. When it finally stopped, Dittmar was alive. The Mi-163 was damaged, but intact. And Heini Dittmar had just established an unofficial world speed record that would remain unmatched for 3 years. 702 miles per hour. Engineers who examined the aircraft after landing discovered that nearly the entire vertical rudder surface had broken away from flutter during the high-speed run. A few more seconds at maximum speed and the aircraft would have come apart in the air. Dittmar had reached the absolute edge of what was aerodynamically possible in 1944. But here was the cruel irony. The Messerschmitt Mi-163 Komet, the fastest aircraft in the world, was almost completely useless as a fighter. The path to this moment had been long and difficult. Alexander Lippisch had begun designing tailless aircraft in the 1920s, experimenting with radical wing configurations that conventional engineers dismissed as impractical. But Lippisch understood aerodynamics in ways others did not. He knew that a tailless design could be more efficient, could reduce drag, could achieve speeds impossible for conventional aircraft. When the German Air Ministry began seeking revolutionary fighter concepts in the late 1930s, Lippisch proposed a rocket-powered tailless interceptor. The concept was radical: no propeller, no tail, powered by volatile chemicals that ignited on contact. Most engineers considered it suicidal. But Germany was preparing for war, and revolutionary ideas were receiving chances they would never get in peacetime. Development began in earnest in 1940. The first prototypes were unpowered gliders, testing the aerodynamic concept. Pilots reported that the aircraft handled unlike anything they had flown. The controls were sensitive. The aircraft wanted to climb. Everything about it felt unnatural. But it flew, and it flew well once pilots adapted to its characteristics. Then came the powered versions with the Walter rocket motor. The acceleration was extraordinary, but the danger was equally extreme. Test pilots were killed. Aircraft exploded on the ground during fueling. The hypergolic fuel mixture, T-Stoff and C-Stoff, was so corrosive and reactive that ground crews wore protective suits. One spill could kill a man in minutes. Between May 1944 and May 1945, approximately 370 Mi-163 aircraft were built. They were deployed to Jägerschwader 400, a fighter unit specifically created to operate the Komet. The unit was based at Brandis Airfield near Leipzig, positioned to intercept American bomber formations attacking targets in central Germany. In 11 months of combat operations, Mi-163 pilots achieved 9 confirmed kills against Allied aircraft, though German records claim as many as 16. Even taking the higher claim, 16 kills in 11 months from a unit equipped with the fastest aircraft ever built. That is a failure by any measure. The failure wasn't because German pilots didn't know how to fly the Me-163. It was because the aircraft's incredible speed was also its fatal weakness. The Me-163 could reach 39,000 feet in 3.5 minutes. No Allied fighter could climb that fast. Once at altitude, it could dive through bomber formations at speeds no gunner could track. But the rocket motor only provided 7.5 minutes of powered flight. After 1 or 2 attack passes, the pilot had to glide back to base with no ability to maneuver. No way to escape if Allied fighters spotted him. Allied pilots quickly learned to simply wait until the Me-163 ran out of fuel, then attack it during its unpowered glide back to the airfield. American fighter pilots developed specific tactics for dealing with the Komet. They would orbit above Me-163 bases at high altitude, watching for the telltale rocket exhaust plume during launch. Once a Komet attacked and its engine cut out, the Americans would dive on the defenseless glider. Some Me-163 pilots were shot down within sight of their own runways, gliding home with empty fuel tanks and no way to defend themselves. The aircraft that could outrun anything in the sky became easy prey the moment its engine stopped. And even when the Me-163 had fuel, its speed created problems. The aircraft carried two 30mm cannons. At 700 miles per hour, a pilot had less than 2 seconds to acquire a target, aim, and fire before overshooting. Most bomber crews never even knew they had been attacked. The Me-163 would flash past them so fast their gunners couldn't track it. But the Me-163 pilot usually missed too, because aiming at that speed required reflexes faster than human biology allowed. German engineers tried to solve this problem. They developed the SG-500 Jägerfaust, an upward-firing weapon system with 650mm recoilless mortars mounted in the wing roots. The idea was that a Komet pilot could fly directly underneath a bomber formation. Photoelectric cells would detect the bomber's shadow and automatically fire the mortars upward. The pilot wouldn't have to aim at all. The system was tested and apparently destroyed at least one Lancaster bomber. But the Jägerfaust was never widely deployed. Most Me-163 pilots had to rely on their two 30mm cannons, trying to hit bombers while flying faster than racing cars travel today. Feldwebel Siegfried Schubert was the most successful Me-163 pilot. He shot down 3 Allied bombers. His first confirmed kill came on August 16, 1944, when he attacked a formation of B-17s. Schubert climbed to altitude in his Me-163, positioned himself above the bomber formation, and dove through them at maximum speed. He fired a short burst from his 30mm cannons as he passed a B-17. The rounds hit the bomber's wing root. The wing folded. The B-17 fell out of formation. Schubert's second and third victories came on August 24, 1944, during a single mission. He attacked another B-17 formation, destroyed one bomber on his first pass, climbed back to altitude on rocket power, and dove through the formation again. His second victim fell trailing smoke. 3 kills in 9 days of operations. Then on October 7, 1944, Schubert was killed when his Me-163 exploded during takeoff. The volatile rocket fuel claimed another pilot. His 3 victories represented the most successful combat record of any Komet pilot. Other experienced pilots scored 1 or 2 victories. Most never hit anything. The problem wasn't the pilot. The problem was that speed without control is just speed. You cannot fight if you cannot aim. Meanwhile, the Me-163 was killing its own pilots. Numerous German pilots died during training and testing. The rocket fuel, a mixture of T-Stoff and C-Stoff, was hypergolic. The 2 chemicals ignited spontaneously when they came in contact. That made the rocket motor reliable. It also made refueling incredibly dangerous. Ground crews wore protective suits. The fuel tanks had to be filled separately to prevent accidental mixing. If a fuel line ruptured on landing, which happened frequently given the aircraft's high landing speed and skid landing gear, the chemicals could leak into the cockpit. In one documented case, Oberleutnant Josky Pose was killed on December 30th, 1943, when a fuel line ruptured during takeoff at Bad Zwischenen. Pose was conducting a test flight in a Me-163 prototype. The wheeled takeoff trolley struck the runway during liftoff and bounced back up into the aircraft's fuselage. The impact ruptured a T-Stoff fuel line. The leaking T-Stoff, a highly corrosive hydrogen peroxide oxidizer, began dissolving Pose's body before rescuers could reach him. Witnesses reported that his right arm had been dissolved to nothing. The other arm and his head were little more than masses of soft tissue. The chemical had eaten through flesh and muscle in minutes. It was one of the most horrific deaths in aviation history, and it illustrated the extreme danger of the Me-163's fuel system. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe abandoned the Me-163 in favor of the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me-262 was slower than the Komet, but it had 30 minutes of powered flight instead of 7 minutes. It had retractable landing gear. It didn't require handling hypergolic rocket fuel, and it could actually shoot down Allied aircraft in meaningful numbers. When the war ended in May 1945, most Me-163 aircraft were sitting on airfields with no fuel, no pilots, and no mission. The fastest aircraft in World War II was also the most spectacular failure. But while German engineers were building rocket-powered interceptors that flew too fast to aim, American engineers were solving a different problem. They were building a fighter that was fast enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, maneuverable enough to dogfight German fighters over their own territory, and reliable enough that pilots actually survived long enough to become aces. The American bomber offensive against Germany had begun in earnest in 1943. The strategy was simple in concept but brutal in execution. Heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, would fly deep into Germany in broad daylight and destroy industrial targets. The bombers flew in tight formations for mutual defensive fire. Each aircraft bristled with .50 caliber machine guns. Gunners were trained to create interlocking fields of fire that would shred any fighter that tried to attack. In theory, the bomber formations were flying fortresses that could defend themselves. In practice, they were dying in appalling numbers. The problem was range. American fighters could escort the bombers partway into Germany, but they couldn't go all the way to the targets and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary escort fighter in 1943, had a combat radius of about 230 miles. That was enough to reach targets in Western Germany, but not deep into the Reich. Once the escorts turned back, German fighters would swarm the unprotected bomber formations. The B-17s and B-24s had defensive armament, but it wasn't enough. German fighters would attack head-on, exploiting the bombers' weakest defensive position. They would coordinate attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming the gunners. They would use heavy cannons that could destroy a bomber with a few hits. In the second half of 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing 5 to 7% of bombers on every mission. That doesn't sound like much until you do the math. A bomber crew had to fly 30 missions to complete their tour. If every mission had a 5% loss rate, the statistical probability of surviving 30 missions was 21%. Most bomber crews didn't come home. The psychological impact was devastating. Crews would wake up, eat breakfast, attend mission briefings, and climb into their aircraft knowing they probably wouldn't survive the war. Some men broke down before ever reaching Germany. Others flew their missions mechanically, emotionally numb, waiting for death. On a single mission to Schweinfurt in October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17s out of 291 dispatched, 20% losses in one day. The target was ball-bearing factories, critical to German war production. The mission planners knew it would be costly, but they believed destroying the factories would cripple German industry. The bombers flew without fighter escort for most of the mission. German fighters attacked in waves. Bf-109s and Fw-190s tore into the formations. Some bombers were hit so many times they simply disintegrated in midair. Others limped back to England on 2 engines, trailing smoke, with dead and wounded crew members inside. American commanders knew they couldn't sustain those casualty rates. Something had to change. That something was the P-51 Mustang. The aircraft had been designed as a private venture by North American Aviation in 1940. The British Royal Air Force ordered the first production models and deployed them in 1942. But the early P-51s had a problem. They were fast and maneuverable at low altitude, but their Allison engines lost power above 15,000 feet. That made them unsuitable for bomber escort missions, which were flown at 25,000 feet or higher. Then someone had an idea. What if they replaced the Allison engine with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin? The Merlin was a supercharged engine that actually gained power at high altitude. North American Aviation obtained a license to build the Merlin in the United States as the Packard V1650. They installed it in the P-51 airframe. The result was extraordinary. The P-51D Mustang combined American airframe design with British engine technology. It was fast at all altitudes. It was maneuverable. And most importantly, it had range. With external drop tanks, a P-51D could fly from England to Berlin and back, a round trip of more than 1,300 miles, and still have fuel left to fight when it got there. Starting in early 1944, Mustangs began escorting bombers all the way to targets in Germany. German fighters that had spent months attacking undefended bomber formations suddenly found themselves fighting American fighters over their own airfields. The tactical situation reversed completely. The bomber loss rate dropped to 2%, then 1%. By mid-1944, American bombers were attacking Berlin in daylight with fewer losses than they had suffered attacking targets in France a year earlier. The Mustang made that possible. On October 12, 1944, First Lieutenant Chuck Yeager was flying a P-51D Mustang he had named Glamorous Glen III over northwestern Germany. Yeager was 21 years old, from Hamlin, West Virginia. He had already been shot down once, evaded capture with help from the French resistance, made his way to Spain, and talked his way back into combat against regulations that prohibited evaders from flying over enemy territory again. He was escorting B-17 bombers on a raid near Bremen. His squadron of 16 Mustangs was flying at 25,000 feet when Yeager spotted a formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters below. He counted 22 of them. The German fighters hadn't seen the Mustangs yet. Yeager and his squadron circled into position and attacked out of the sun. What happened next became one of the most famous dogfights of the war. As Yeager maneuvered his P-51 to fire at a trailing Bf-109, the German fighter suddenly turned left and collided with his wingman. Both German pilots bailed out. 2 victories without firing a shot. Then the sky erupted into a wild turning dogfight. Bf-109s and P-51s spinning and diving in every direction. Yeager spotted another Bf-109 and fired from 600 yards. The German fighter exploded. His third victory. Another Bf-109 came at him from behind. Yeager reversed, got on the German pilot's tail, and fired again. Another kill, his fourth. By now, the dogfight had descended from 25,000 feet to 15,000 feet. German pilots were trying to escape. Yeager spotted a fifth Bf-109 trying to break away. He chased it down and destroyed it. 5 enemy aircraft in one mission. Yeager became an ace in a day. The entire engagement lasted less than 15 minutes. When the smoke cleared, Yeager's squadron had destroyed 8 of the 22 German fighters without losing a single Mustang. It was a kind of lopsided victory that would have been impossible a year earlier. The P-51 gave American pilots the tools they needed to dominate German airspace. The P-51D Mustang wasn't the fastest fighter in World War II. Its maximum speed was 440 miles per hour, far slower than the Me-163 Komet at 700 miles per hour or even the Me-262 jet at 540 miles per hour. But the Mustang had something more important than raw speed. It had range. A P-51D could fly from England to Berlin and back, a round trip of more than 1,300 miles, and still have fuel left to fight when it got there. No other fighter in the world could do that in 1944. The difference was dramatic. In October 1943, before P-51 escorts became widespread, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single week. By March 1945, with full P-51 escort coverage, the 8th Air Force flew over 1,000 bomber sorties in a single day with minimal losses. That transformation happened because one aircraft could go far enough. Meanwhile, the Germans were also building jet fighters that actually worked. The Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe entered combat in July 1944. Unlike the Me-163 rocket fighter, the Me-262 was a practical combat aircraft. It had retractable landing gear, long enough flight time to complete a mission, and heavy armament that could destroy a bomber in a single pass. It was also faster than any Allied fighter. Between July 1944 and May 1945, German pilots claimed 542 Allied aircraft destroyed by Me-262s, though actual confirmed victories were likely lower. But the Allies shot down or destroyed on the ground more than 300 Me-262s. The Me-262 could have been a game-changer if Germany had deployed it earlier and in larger numbers, but it entered service too late. So, who was the king of speed in World War II? If you measure purely by maximum velocity, the answer is clear. The Messerschmitt Me-163 Komet at 702 miles per hour. No aircraft built during World War II flew faster. Heini Dittmar's record from July 6, 1944, stood until October 14, 1947, when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1 at 891 miles per hour. But measuring success by top speed alone misses the point. The Me-163 flew approximately 300 missions and scored 9 confirmed kills, a 3% success rate. The P-51 flew hundreds of thousands of missions and was credited with nearly 5,000 air-to-air victories in Europe alone. If you measure by strategic impact, the answer is the P-51 Mustang. Not the fastest, but fast enough, with range that changed the entire dynamic of the air war over Europe. If you measure by technological achievement, the answer is the Me-262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter, the aircraft that showed every air force in the world what the future looked like. Speed only matters if you can use it. The Me-163 was so fast its pilots couldn't aim. The Me-262 was fast enough to be effective, but vulnerable on takeoff and landing. The P-51 was slower than both, but reliable enough that pilots like Chuck Yeager could fly 64 missions and survive. Heini Dittmar survived the war and returned to civilian life as a sailplane designer and competition pilot. He died in 1960 during a test flight at age 48. Chuck Yeager became one of the most famous test pilots in history, broke the sound barrier, commanded fighter squadrons during the Vietnam War, and died in December 2020 at age 97. When people asked Yeager what made the P-51 special, he said it was honest. It didn't try to do anything it couldn't do. Everything on the aircraft worked the way it was supposed to work. That made it a pilot's airplane. And that's the real answer to who was king of speed in World War II. It depends on what you value.